what we thought we'd start the new year off with was just a presentation of sort of summarizing some of the work actually the three of us have been working on collaboratively, and thinking about adolescent dating violence in Canada. We're going to show some results from the Health Behavior Survey of school-age children, which is a national survey run in Canada. And we're going to talk about some findings from that research. And we're going to talk about some work we've been doing in policy, and then thinking about what are the implications of this work for maybe the work that you're doing. All of you know everybody who's part of this work, so I'm not going to go into a big introduction. I just want to say it's a complete honor to work with Deinera, who is a Canada Research Chair at the University of Calgary in the Department of Psychology. And she's cross-affiliated with social work and other departments. And she really has been a pioneer in leading the work in Canada on teen dating violence. And I know all of us have had experiences where we've benefited from her knowledge and her experience. And so it's been great to collaborate with her on this work, and really always look forward to hearing her speak. The other person that will be presenting today is Liz Baker. And Liz is relatively new, but not that new now, to our team. And she's a research scientist at the University of Calgary. And she got her PhD at Penn State. And she also did an internship at the Institute of Research to Policy Collaboration. And I think what I've really valued in terms of working with Liz is not only her breadth and depth of knowledge, her statistical skills and understanding, but also her deep thinking around how we can really move science to practice and practice into science. So it's been a real delight and a pleasure to also collaborate with Liz. So on that note, now I'm going to hand it over.
Cool. Can you hear me okay? Am I muted? Oh, you're good. Okay, cool. All right. Yes, thank you everyone for attending today. We always love talking about the work we're doing on dating violence research. So just to start, we want to acknowledge that the work we're presenting today is from a Western scientific perspective, which doesn't mean it's the only or indeed the superior way of knowing, but it is the way that Wendy, Liz, and myself have been trained. And so this is just one perspective on dating violence coming from a specific way of knowing, and there's many other ways of knowing about dating violence that are equally important to consider. And some of that will be covered in our Making Connections groups. For myself, I'm a third generation white settler. I was really fortunate to grow up in Treaty 4 7/7 territory right on the border in what is colonially known as Medicine Hat. I now am a guest on Treaty 7 territory in Calgary, traditionally called Mohkinstsis and Blackfoot, or colonially known as Calgary. We are home to the Blackfoot Confederacy, as well as the Tsuut'ina and the Stoney Nakoda, and the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. And the bottom picture is from Stoney Nakoda territory. It's a beautiful setting, and I'm always so grateful for all the care that was taken that lets us live here, and also cognizant of our responsibilities as treaty people to continue to advance reconciliation through words and actions. So that's a bit about me. Wendy, did you want to go next?
Sure. I'm a fourth generation white settler. I'm a mother, and I live on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory. And I'm very grateful to have access to these lands. And I'm on my own personal journey as a person who studies development and is really interested in how do we promote healthy development for all. So I've been on a very long journey and a continuing journey to become a better ally and advocate for all those that I meet and work with, and especially focus with an Indigenous perspective.
Thanks.
Over to you, Liz.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. My name is Liz. I am a first-generation white settler from Wauwatosa, which is home to the Potawatomi and Menominee people. I am also a mother, and I moved, I guess, about 3 years ago to Treaty 7 territory, which, as Deinera mentioned, is known as Calgary, and will, of course, just echo everything that was said about having great opportunities to learn more about the land that I'm living on, and that I'm very grateful to be here, and will do my best to be a guest here for as long as I'm able to.
Great, thank you. So now I'll give a bit of an overview for our talk today. We're going to be sharing it amongst ourselves as we've all been collaborating on this work. So I'm going to speak first about some prevalence data, some tensions in prevalence data that we often see in teen dating violence research, and my own personal conceptual framework for how I've come to reconcile these tensions. Then Liz is going to talk about some of our work on risk and protective factors for dating violence, what we know and also what we don't. And then Wendy will wrap us up with work on prevention, particularly a policy review that we have been conducting for the past 18 months that's still very much ongoing, but we'll let you know what we've learned so far about dating violence policy in Canada. So I'm sure, I'm speaking to folks who are deeply engaged in this, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, when I say adolescent dating violence, I'm talking about physical, sexual, and psychological violence, as well as stalking that's experienced within a dating and/or sexual relationship, very broadly defined in adolescence. For the work that we do at PREVNet and in my lab, the Hope Lab at the University of Calgary, we specifically look at youth aged 18 and under, or grades 7 to 12, 6 to 12. And that's because, not because at 18 something magical happens and you become a full-grown adult, but legally, obviously there's a lot that changes at 18. And so that is why we use that cutoff in our work, because we really want to look at what's happening for folks considered minors under the law when they're experiencing this violence in their relationship. As I'm sure you all know, this violence can happen in person or electronically. It happens in heterosexual and same-sex dating relationship. It can happen to people of any genders and between current and/or former partners. I'm not going to talk too much about outcomes today, but we've done quite a bit of work on this, looking at long-term outcomes of dating violence, primarily because this is really important to make policy arguments, also because we want to know what kind of supports youth might need following dating violence. And so the work that we've done has shown that dating violence is associated in the long term, 5 years up to 12 years later, with numerous adverse health outcomes, including poor mental health and substance use, injury, homicide, which I'll talk about. And one of the findings that I think we draw on the most is that we've shown that dating violence is very strongly linked to future domestic violence, re-victimization, even controlling for things like child maltreatment. So we know that dating violence is a really unique predictor of future violence, and that to prevent that cycle of violence from happening, we really need to be focusing on preventing dating violence, which all of you are doing. Not to start with the starkest statistic, but of course, we worry about a lot of outcomes for dating violence, but the most consequential and severe outcome is homicide. And so based on Statistics Canada data and the Canadian Domestic Violence Homicide Initiative review, we know that about 16% of domestic homicide victims in Canada over a 10-year period were aged 14 to 24. In the age group of 14 to 17, that was about 2% of victims, which is an underrepresentation based on population size, which is a good thing. But in the age group 18 to 24, about 14% of victims were in that age range, which is a overrepresentation of that population. And so starting around age 18, risk of homicide increases quite a bit, and the highest risk age group is ages 25 to 34. And most victims are women and other marginalized genders. And so what this tells us, again, is that dating, that window before 18 is really critical to be doing prevention work for lots of reasons, but in part towards preventing future domestic homicide. So I'm going to talk about a continuum today when I get to how I think about prevalence data. So I'll just start with a general continuum, which many of you may also use, and sort of talk about what the data can and can't tell us. So I think most of the folks here are probably focused on promoting healthy relationships, and healthy can be defined lots of different ways depending on where you are, your context, cultural considerations. Myself, I define healthy as safe, supportive, and violence-free. So pretty broad, but there are places where youth feel like somebody cares about them, they have support, they're not afraid, they feel happy. So that's kind of, what we're all working towards and what we would like every youth to have in all of their interpersonal relationships. Moving along the continuum, though, we know that unfortunately a lot of youth experience unhealthy relationships. So these relationships are places where youth may not feel very safe, very happy. It's impacting, their well-being, they're not supportive. But if we keep moving along the continuum, we might get to abusive relationships where youth are experiencing severe violence and aggression from partners, a lot of power and control dynamics. So I'll talk more about these categories when I get to my conceptual model, but just as sort of a caveat, a lot of the prevalence data does not differentiate between unhealthy and abusive. And so that is definitely a limit in the field, as we don't yet know a lot about what do unhealthy relationships look like? How are those different from abusive? So I'll talk a bit about how I've pulled together theory and research to think about this, but when I'm presenting prevalence data today, it's definitely a mix of these groups in the blue section of the continuum. All right, so given all that, what do we know about prevalence? I will start with cisgender youth, which is where the majority of research is. We're just doing a systematic review right now on gender and sexual minority youth and dating violence prevalence, like what's out there in the literature. There's actually quite a bit, though still not enough, but definitely in the past few years, a large increase in what we know about prevalence for sexual minority youth, which I won't talk about today, but we know very, very little about gender diverse youth. So I'll talk about that a bit at the end. Okay, so what do we know about the prevalence of adolescent dating violence in Canada? So as Wendy mentioned, this comes from the Health, Behavior in School-Age Children study, which is a nationally representative study. Just to give you a sense, folks in this data collection were in grades 9 and 10. Average age is about 15. The makeup of the sample represents how youth look nationally. So majority white, but otherwise representing other racialized categories. There's a slight underrepresentation of Indigenous youth, just to give you a sense of the data. So what we found when we looked at this, so this study looks at 3 types of victimization and perpetration. So psychological victimization, having a partner try to control or emotionally hurt you, someone you were dating or going out with trying to emotionally hurt you or control you. Physical, so physically hurting you on purpose, as well as cyber, so using social media to emotionally hurt you or control you within a cyber domain. So in terms of psychological, and we've split this by the binary gender category that most youth in this data fall into, about 1 in 3 girls report psychological victimization in the past 12 months. And about 1 in 5 boys are reporting psychological victimization. For cyber victimization, about 1 in 5 girls are reporting in the past 5 months, about 15% of boys. And then for physical, about 1 in 10 boys and girls report victimization. I will get to this physical stat at the end when I talk about my conceptual model and tensions in the field, but that 1 in 10 number is really consistent with what we see in the US as well. Girls are significantly more likely in these data to report psychological and cyber victimization. In terms of sexual violence, HBSC doesn't measure that. This can be trickier. A lot of schools don't want this asked, unfortunately, but we do have a provincially representative sample from Quebec with about 8,000 students where they were able to ask this. These students are in grades 10 to 12. And so here they measured sexual violence victimization as unwanted kissing, attempts at forced sex, as well as the experience of forced sex. And here we see what is common in the literature, that this is disproportionately experienced by girls. So about 1 in 5 girls in these data report unwanted sexual experiences within the past 12 months, and about 1 in 20 boys report. In terms of stalking, we actually know very little about this. There really aren't many, if any, surveys that capture stalking behavior. And so we use police reported data, which of course is only the tip of the iceberg, probably skews older in terms of who thinks, they're even able to report to police. But what we know from police reported data, and also the most recent data we have is from 2014. So getting a bit old, but what we know from that data is that the majority, about 2/3 of stalking victims in Canada were girls and women. About half of stalking victims were in that age range 15 to 34. So again, really critical period for prevention in mid-adolescence. About 3/4 of folks that were stalked in these data indicated that the person who stalked them was male. And so those are just some of the data in Canada. So it is a problem. And unfortunately, we really don't have a ton of measurement, but something that's very important to address within our prevention efforts. Okay, so I just wanted to talk a bit about cisgender parity. This continues to be a large area of tension in the field. So much like with adult samples, we see that in nationally representative surveys that use items of more minor severity, we tend to see boys and girls reporting fairly similar rates of physical and sometimes psychological victimization. Whereas when we look at police reported data, that definitely is disproportionately girls and women who are reporting partner violence. So what's happening? So I'm just going to talk about my little model. This is based on, my work in the field, theory, work with survivors, and sort of how I've come to reconcile this tension, because it continues to come up in the work that we do. So here we're back to our continuum. So on the healthy side, what would we like to see? Consistent use of appropriate conflict negotiation, no use of violence and aggression. That doesn't mean there's not, some maybe poor conflict negotiation, but nobody feels unsafe. People feel respected and supported. So that to me is what we're working towards. In this middle area, this is where I think we see that cisgender parity on physical victimization. So this tends to be use of more minor physical and psychological victimization. So pushing and shoving, name calling, often what we would call mutual. So both partners in the relationship are using that behavior. And that here, although power and control may be some part of it, it's not the primary driver of violence and aggression. What I think is happening here is developmentally, youth are developing, emotion regulation. They're in these new interpersonal relationships for the first time. And so their conflict negotiation really takes a hit. And Liz has done some nice work to show this. So even if they're good with parents and peers, romantic settings are new. They've got to learn how to do it. And so I think, this is what Diane Folingstead, who works on psychological aggression, calls boorish relationship behavior. So it's not good. We want to prevent it. It's still unhealthy, but it's really coming out of a place of development and learning how to negotiate conflict, though that doesn't mean that partners don't feel unsafe. And then as we move up the continuum, we see use of severe physical and psychological aggression. So like throwing against a wall, beating up, burning, those kinds of things. Psychological aggression that's really focused on controlling behavior, threatening behavior, use of sexual violence and stalking. And here, I believe, power and control dynamics are a primary driver. Victims tend to be disproportionately girls and women, and one partner may feel extremely unsafe. So the violence tends to be one way, or if there's mutual, it's because of self-defense. So this is, I'd be happy to chat about this. This is how I've come to conceptualize the literature and sort of reconciling these tensions that we see around gender parity in reporting and physical victimization. Okay, so now on to perpetration. This is from that same survey, same questions. Overall in the field, we know a lot less about perpetration. Most school districts don't want you to ask about this, so we just have less data. So it's awesome that HBSC asks about this, but we have a lot less comparators. So in terms of psychological victimization or perpetration, we see about 10% of girls and 7% of boys reporting psychological perpetration, about 7% of girls and boys reporting cyber perpetration, and about 7% reporting physical. So these numbers are a lot lower, which we tend to see with perpetration. Is that because people don't want to report the behavior? Is it because, small minority of youth are doing most of the perpetration? We don't really know the answer, but here we don't see any gender differences in perpetration either. So lots of questions about perpetration. We just know a lot less about the underlying mechanisms. However, we do see, and this is consistent in the literature, this data comes from that provincially representative sample in Quebec, a much higher rate of sexual violence perpetration by cisgender boys than cisgender girls. And that's really consistent across the literature and consistent with the conceptual model I presented. I'm going to talk a little bit about patterns, and then I'll turn it over to Liz because this is her work and she's going to talk about this in terms of risk and protective factors. But of course, youth don't exist in these neat categories. There are patterns of behavior that are happening. And so Liz worked on a type of analysis that allows us to look at what are those patterns in the data. And so I'll present that to you now because I think that can be really illuminating about what's happening. And then Liz will talk about risk and protective factors within these patterns. So consistent with the literature, and this is a good thing, we see that most youth in our data, about 2/3, are really not reporting any victimization or perpetration. So we called these youth uninvolved in the paper. So certainly these youth still need universal healthy relationship support to continue having healthy relationships, but this is a good news story that most youth are not using these behaviors. And this is consistent with other analyses in Canada and the US. In our data, about 1/3 of people are in this purple line. And so those are folks who experience a lot of psychological and cyber victimization. So you can see where there's this purple peak that lines up with psychological. Cyber is also elevated. And so they're experiencing victimization only. They're really not perpetrating. You can see on the perpetration items, this like flat purple line. And so we have this group, about 2/3 or 1/3 of the sample, who's really only experiencing victimization. And then we have this pink line, which is probably the group we are most concerned about, is a small percentage of the sample, so about 5%. But probably very much in need of intervention. And so in this group, we see high levels of perpetration and then fairly high levels of victimization. So we've called that mutual violence. I know that can not be a label everyone loves, but just to align with the literature, we've called it that. But Liz will go more into maybe what's going on with these kids, but certainly a group in need of intervention. We didn't find a perpetration only group, which we think is just because these guys are still a little bit young. They're in grades 9 and 10. Perpetration tends to peak later in adolescence. And so that's why I think we don't see that in these data. Just to close my section, again, really very little on gender diverse youth, an area in need of much attention, but I'll present what we have. So in terms of prevalence of dating violence, so these are youth who in the data didn't identify as girls or boys, so we've broadly referred to them as non-binary because we don't know, exactly how they identify. And I'll just present victimization, then perpetration. So all victimization rates for non-binary youth in our sample are significantly higher than for their cisgender peers. So this replicates other data, primarily with adults, that shows that non-binary folks are at much higher risk due to societal transphobia, as well as minority stress. And so, what this tells us is that non-binary and gender diverse youth are in need of a lot of support with healthy relationships due to no fault of their own, but as they are experiencing this victimization because of the oppression they face. We also see elevated rates of perpetration among non-binary youth. This may be in self-defense. Again, we don't know the reasoning. So actually a colleague of ours, Alexa Martin-Story, is now really looking at this in some of her work and trying to think about what's going on and some of the mechanisms that might underlie this, including internalized transphobia, homophobia, but definitely a group in need of research and practice attention. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Liz. I will stop sharing so she can share her slides, and then we'll continue.
just adjust this quickly. All right. Let me know if there's any issues with seeing it, but hopefully you should be looking at my screen now. So like Deinera mentioned, I'll now be talking a little bit about what we've recently learned about risk and protective factors among Canadian youth, expanding on the study that Deinera was just talking about. So first, I'd just like to talk about a conceptual model that explains one way we can think about risk and protective factors, known as the social ecological model. So this model tells us that there are many different levels to consider when thinking about risk and protective factors, which includes both the individual, interpersonal, community, and societal levels. And that also we need to think about how time or youth development can shape people's experiences. And a lot of previous research has focused on individual level risk and protective factors, but we aim to move beyond this to more comprehensively understand risk and protective factors in context. So we were interested in understanding adolescent dating violence by examining societal factors and then also developmental factors. So again, this is showing what Deinera just mentioned. In this paper, we wondered if patterns of dating violence varied by power relations. So we looked at how power might interact with the larger social context. And to do this, we examined youth's experience of social marginalization due to factors such as race and immigration. We also looked at developmental power in interpersonal relationships, since we were interested in how youth may come to develop power over time. So we know that one developmental function of peer relationships is that youth learn how to use power with their similar age peers. So unfortunately, in many peer relationships, this can look like using and experiencing bullying behavior. So as adolescents enter into dating relationships, they begin to explore whether and how to use power within this new interpersonal setting, and some may transfer what they have learned in the peer context to the romantic context. So in this paper, we looked at both social marginalization due to various factors, as well as developmental power as indicated by bullying behaviors, which all tie back into both the continuum of violence as well as the social ecological model. So first, what we did is we compared youth who were in the psychological and cyber victimization group to those who were uninvolved with dating violence. So those in the psychological and cyber victimization group were more likely to be older girls living in poverty. Since girls were more likely than boys to be in the victimization group as compared to the uninvolved group, this supports a feminist theory interpretation of these patterns. And although research over the years has demonstrated that youth living in poverty are more likely to experience dating violence victimization, we're not aware of much research that has really interpreted these findings as a result of the structural marginalization associated with living in poverty. So this is a really important area for future research. And then moreover, when we consider developmental power relations or involvement with bullying, we found that compared to those who were uninvolved with dating violence, the psychological and cyber victimization group were more likely to use and experience all forms of bullying, except the use of weight-based bullying. So this is in line with other research suggesting violence in the peer context transfers to the romantic context and is supportive of a developmental contextual understanding of adolescent dating violence. We then compared youth in the mutual violence group to those who were uninvolved. And so those in the mutual violence group were more likely to be older, racialized, be first or second generation Canadians, and had experienced food insecurity. So we really need to think critically about why this might be, and to do so with attention to sociological understandings of power and what those might mean for dating violence. So for example, because the racism and xenophobia many racialized and immigrant youth face, their use of dating violence in the mutual violence class may represent a way of accessing power and control in social systems that rob them of this control. Moreover, when considering developmental power relationships, again, bullying, we found that compared to those who are in the uninvolved class, excuse me, the mutual violence group were more likely to both use and experience all forms of bullying, which is again supportive of a developmental contextual understanding of adolescent dating violence, where youth may be learning how to use power with peers and then transfer that to romantic partners. Third, we compared those who were in the mutual violence group to those in the psychological and cyber victimization groups. So those in the mutual violence group are more likely to be boys, racialized, and recent immigrants, whereas in the psychological and cyber group, youth were more likely to be white and girls. So again, this suggests a need for a structural as well as developmental understanding to help us really think about the root causes that may explain these findings, but one that goes beyond traditional feminist understandings. Also, just as a note, the youth in the mutual violence group were not actually more likely to be older as compared to those in the victimization group. We did also, for all of these analyses, look at intersections, but unfortunately didn't find anything. However, we think that we did not find something because of the sample size and we're likely underpowered to actually detect effects. When we think about the developmental power relations, it wasn't as clear cut as the other. So we have a table here to just show that to you all. So those in the mutual violence group were more likely to use all forms of bullying as compared to the psychological and cyber victimization groups, and to experience physical and weight-based bullying. But as you can see here, there weren't other differences in experiencing bullying for the other types. So similar story here again, that the use of bullying shows how youth may have learned to use power in relationships, and that in the mutual violence group, there were more boys and girls as compared to the psychological and cyber victimization group, which was made up of more girls who were not using bullying. So again, coming back to the root causes, thinking critically about what may be at play here when we are making our interpretations. So just want to return to the figure now to kind of put a visual to what we've been talking about, and a reminder to interpret these findings from a structural ideology. So society and time can shape access to resources, as well as how youth experience bias and discrimination. And then that in turn affects youth's experiences at both the individual, interpersonal, and community levels. So putting this in context of the paper I just discussed, we can return again to one finding from our paper, the finding that youth who were in the mutual violence group, the one that we may be most concerned about, were more likely to be racialized and first or second generation Canadians. When thinking about why this might be, again, moving a step beyond to think about root causes, and that we have the social logical understandings of power and what it might mean for these kids. So like I mentioned before, it may be that because the racism and xenophobia that they face can impact their experiences. So their use of dating violence in that class may represent a way of trying to access power and control when they live in a society of social systems that rob them of this control. Just want to finish with this. In a recent paper, which we have as open access and also on our website, if anyone wants a copy of it, Clausen and colleagues found that despite the fact that we need interventions to be comprehensive and include multiple levels of someone's social ecology, we actually don't know a whole lot beyond the individual and relationship levels. So this is kind of a call to continue to conduct additional research that also investigates community and societal factors to really better comprehensively inform prevention efforts. And that's where I'll stop and turn over to Deinera and Wendy.
Cool. Well, thanks, Liz. Wendy, do you want to share your slides, and I'll just do my first two and then turn it to you? Or I can if you prefer.
Give me a minute.
Okay.
Sorry, I wasn't ready for that moment.
No worries.
Yeah, maybe you should, Dana.
Okay.
I'm not quite ready.
Sure, I can do that, no problem. Okay, so closed captions. So we'll end today with prevention. Since that's what I know a lot of you are focused on. Just coming back to this model, as I know is not new information to any of you. We know that effective violence prevention requires a focus on root causes and systems of oppression and how those shape experiences with victimization, perpetration. So we always want to keep that in mind when we're thinking about prevention approaches. Today, we're going to talk more about policy approaches, which can absolutely shape, access to resources for folks. So kind of fitting in with this, but as we do programs as well, we're always thinking about, how do we address the fact that a lot of risk for violence comes out of societal and historical factors that mean some groups get more access to resources and others get less simply because of the social group they belong to. And how does that then shape victimization and perpetration, and how can we intervene on that? In terms of prevention, you may have seen this, prevention people love triangles. And so we have a triangle for everything. And here's our dating violence triangle. So there are 3 levels of prevention intervention you might hear people talking about. People use different words just to keep us on our toes. So this bottom blue level, where we hope to reach most youth, maybe 80%, is the primary prevention or universal prevention, what a lot of you are working on. And so this is universal classroom curriculums, social emotional learning, daily teaching practices, things that we're offering to all youth to hopefully help them to never be in a violent relationship. So stopping the violence before it starts. Then we have secondary prevention, also called secondary intervention, also called selective intervention. And these would be typically small group programs, often offered in school, although perhaps in community settings, specifically for youth at higher risk of dating violence. So this could be for youth who've experienced child maltreatment, who've been exposed and or have witnessed domestic violence. Those are 2 common groups, youth who've experienced a lot of trauma. And so we know a lot less about these in the primary groups, but there are a couple of evidence-based groups at the secondary level. And then if we move up to the green section, which we hope, is the smallest part of the triangle, these are folks that unfortunately, despite our prevention efforts, have experienced and or used violence in their relationships, known as tertiary prevention or intervention or indicated intervention. And this is usually going to look like screening, referral to clinical services, stuff that's done outside of the school, could look like legal or justice system remedies as well. And so this is for folks who have experienced or used violence, and now we need to address what's happened to prevent, further ongoing harm and impact. And so in Wendy's part today, she's going to talk about work we've been doing at the tertiary level in terms of policy that's available. So Wendy, do you want me to just keep sharing and go through?
I'm ready now.
Got it. All right, cool. And then I'll turn it to Wendy.
Okay. Said she confidently. Okay, we can see it.
Yes, we can.
Can't see where you're, but I'll assume you can. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I'm just going to talk a bit about policy, and policy is really important because once we develop policy, then we're identifying an issue is really important, and we're building sustainability and addressing it over time. So once we integrate and identify an issue like teen dating violence into policy, it's more likely that it's going to be sustained, that we're going to continue to pay attention to it, to assess it, to monitor it, and to provide resources and support over time. So as Deinera mentioned, I'm going to talk about the work that we've been doing primarily on tertiary kinds of interventions, with a little bit of a review about what we know about policy on primary interventions. So basically, most of the work has happened in the United States. Canada is way far behind in terms of our research, in terms of our understanding about what's available for teen dating violence legislation. So teen dating violence legislation first appeared in the United States national policy in 2005. And that was in an amended version of the Violence Against Women Act of 1994. And with that, it was identified that school-based prevention programs later became a later amendment onto that, thinking about that we need to think about how to prevent it in schools. And that appeared around 2013. So there's been research done by others that have looked at and reviewed all of the sort of policies within the United States. And what this research basically found was that there were 44 states that had dating violence relationships in their requirements for obtaining a civil order of protection. So that 44 states had it. And then of those 44 states, 48 states allowed minors to obtain civil orders of protection. 14 allowed them to file it on their own behalf, which is really important because it means that you don't need to access that adult, you not having to disclose it. It supports the confidentiality of what's happening in their lives. Among those states, there's huge variation in what types of acts are included of violence, or what types of violence are included that enable you to obtain that order of protection. In terms of what's available, there are 26 states that have school level adolescent dating violence legislation. And so that's about almost half the states that have that. And about a third of those actually had a definition of what constitutes teen dating violence. And 13 had a legislation that stated that schools should have a policy to address it. So you can see there's huge variation in terms of what are the remedies to address it. And there's huge variation in terms of the number of states that have it. The other piece that's really important is that 22 states had legislation that includes that they must have teen dating violence prevention programming. So thinking about that continuum of risk, you want to have prevention programming. You then want to be able to address it if that you want to name it, and you want to be able to have remediations in order to address it. There's research that has showed that the strength of the legislation varies. And we know that the higher prevalences of teen dating violence are associated with weaker legislation. So in other words, having policy makes a difference. Having policy is associated with having lower levels of teen dating violence. So I think it's really important that we think about that. What is our ideal laws, or what is ideal that we want to have? Well, we want to have mandatory teen dating violence prevention and education for all school personnel. The recommendations from this article also included thinking about specific intervention strategies to respond to reports and incidents of teen dating violence. We want to require teen dating violence awareness programs also for parents, because they may not know the signs of it. And we also need to include sort of primary prevention activities. Weak legislation is less comprehensive and fails to include, one or more of these components that are associated with having strong legislation. And having that strong legislation was associated with a lower prevalence rate overall. So what's happening in Canada? Well, as I mentioned, Canada is much newer, and we've been working more recently to look at all of the policies in Canada. And when we think about this work, it's about 20 years behind the United States. In general, in terms of our understanding about teen dating violence, we're just learning about the prevalence and the correlates and the risk factors and the protective factors. So when you think about it in the Canadian context, there's really been limited research, Canadian research, that has helped to form the foundation of our policy development. So in this work, our original efforts where we partnered with a law firm, and we worked with them to pull all the relevant provincial, territorial, and federal teen dating violence relevant legislation in Canada. And what they found was there is about 34 policies, 2 federal, 27 provincial, and 5 territorial. And these policies were found in different portfolios. So some were found in education, some were found in children's services, and others were found in domestic or family violence, and the last ones were found in justice. And so what we did from that original work is that we created, and I'm sure many of you have seen it, we had a webinar on it, that interactive plain language legislation map. And what we did, and what really motivated that work, was when we were working with educators, they wanted to know what their responsibilities were if a student disclosed. And so that was our attempt to really sort of address that and provide them with some background. So you can go on that map and youth can see and get information about what's available in their specific region, for example. There's advice for teachers, for educators, and for parents. So it was our first initial attempt to provide that information for the general public. And we built that map out in French and English. So I think what we found basically is that there just wasn't a lot of policy. I'm just going to quick because I've now just looked at the time. So the quick answer was there wasn't a significant amount of policy, but we thought we needed to dig deeper and we needed to do more. And we thought maybe it's possible that we're not finding some policies. And so what could we do more? So we then took the next steps and we looked under existing domestic violence policies. And basically what we found is that none of those provincial or territorial policies ever mentioned teen dating violence. So there was no mention of it. So remember when I started this, I talked about how important it is if you name it and if you label it, it becomes something that we put resources towards, we address, and we provide those resources to make a difference. What we did find, and I'll show you the map across the country from each of the policies, but what we did find is that the terminology did vary by province. That 2 of the 12 policies had a definition of intimate relationships that could maybe apply to teen dating violence. So we were trying to figure out if it could apply even the legislation itself, but there was such a variation in policy. There were 3 out of 10 policies we weren't sure if it applied to teen dating violence or not. 6 out of 10 we thought maybe might apply, and then only 1 out of 12 primarily focused on like family members. So really not applicable. But here's a map that sort of shows and summarizes in a more general way about what some of the things that we found. And so when you think about this legislation, we have likely applies. We found policy in Nunavut and in Ontario that likely applies, so that it specifically names that dating violences are included in it, and it can apply after the age of 14. We found some where blue, so the Yukon, Manitoba, and New Brunswick, but we thought, well, maybe that might apply in those, but we weren't sure because, for example, in the Yukon, they indicated that it had to be an intimate companionship, but it wasn't defined, and we weren't sure if it could, what an intimate companion meant, and we weren't sure if it could apply to teens, for example. In Manitoba, why we said maybe was it doesn't define what the types of relationships were, or it doesn't give an age restriction. So you could apply it, even though it wasn't specifically named or the age wasn't specifically defined. And then if you, so I mean, the point of this is that really there's not a lot of good legislation that is applicable to teen dating violence, and it's really very limited across it. So now we're going back and we're looking at supplemental policies and case law to continue to understand this. But I think the bottom line or the takeaway message is that we do not have policy in Canada that addresses teen dating violence, and we need to develop it at the federal and the provincial territorial level. We may get good indication about how to do that from looking at the bullying policies, and we're currently developing, we're currently reviewing all the bullying policies to compare them. And I would say that this notion about that teen dating violence is where bullying policy was 20 years ago, and we have a lot of work to do. In terms of like what needs to be in the policy, I think it's really important to think about what you say and what we've learned in the past. So basically, I think there's some key elements of policy that need to be included. And I think the first piece is that the policy needs to be school-based. But it's also, so schools in Canada, as you're aware, are come under provincial mandate. So I think that's why we have included and we have focused on the importance of what we need at the provincial level. But also we need things at the federal level, because many of the high-risk populations who might be involved in teen dating violence are not in school. and so they wouldn't receive the prevention information or the intervention support. So I think we need to involve both levels of government, and we need policy at both levels. If we think about within schools, the policy needs to ensure that there's enough support to implement the policy and to ensure that the policy has sustainability over time. So we need to address things like education, we need training, we need prevention, we need reporting processes. We need to think about what are the roles and the responsibilities and who's doing what and who has the training to do it in a focused way. And we need to make sure that the teachers have trained, the school counselors are trained, and the youth support are trained, so that we have a lot of work to do. That if we're going to put these policies in place, we need to ensure that the schools and the educators and the personnel have the support and the training that they need to be effective to implement that. So I think and the challenge will always be, and it's one that we ran into when we were doing the work in bullying, is that schools may not see themselves as responsible for addressing this issue. Although in our own work, over 90% of teachers said that they thought that they should. So I think it's really the best place to reach youth, because by law, most youth are required to attend school. So even though it may seem outside the school mandate, teachers perceive it's within their mandate, and it's the best way to reach the majority of youth. The next thing is that policies need to focus on restorative processes, not punishment. You know, youth are still developing and unfolding. So like we have to help them and scaffold them with the skills like the conflict resolution, like emotional regulation, like an understanding of consent, that we have to give them those skills and scaffold them and learning them and implementing them and coach them through a positive lens and a positive youth development framework. That they're not yet, we have to give them an opportunity to develop those skills. So we really think that it needs to come from a restorative and positive youth development perspective. The other thing about the policies is that one of the things that we learned is across the country in our review, it's not named, and if it's named, it's not consistently defined or it's ambiguously defined. We need to have a common definition, so that if we can operate from a common definition, then we'll be able to monitor and assess how effective our policies are, but we'll also be able to create a culture that has a common understanding about what the behavior is that we're addressing. One of the challenges in the work is around confidentiality. And I sort of alluded to that. You know, we have to balance between informing the parents and protecting the confidentiality and the privacy of youth. So we don't want to have to tell parents, like we have to balance what does the youth need? What's the most supportive response to the youth? And one thing is we may not want to out them if we have to tell parents, and parents may not even know that they're in a relationship or the kind of relationship that we're in. So we really have to think about in this policy how to balance the needs of safety, privacy, and protection. One of the things that's really important is that adults have a perspective about what youth may need and what youth may be supportive to youth, but really we need to engage youth in this process, because it's youth that are living these lives and these experiences. So we need to engage youth in not only developing the policy, but reviewing the policy, and also in developing solutions about how to address it and how to be effective in it. And I think what's really important is we need to be monitoring these kinds of behaviors. Given the long-term negative outcomes that are associated with it, we need to ensure that our policy is having the positive effect. We need to understand if the problem is getting worse or if it's improving. And then we need to engage in an iterative process and address and change what's in our policy. And I think really important also in all of this is that we need to have equity in our policy. We need to recognize that this may be challenging for different communities to implement, and we may need to adapt and have a more individualized response and solutions. So we need to think about how different cultures may be viewing teen dating violence? What are their views about dating? And what are the roles of the young people's stereotype about how to behave in relationships? So in developing the policy and implementing the policy and evaluating the policy, we need to think through an equity-based lens. We took our work and we are actually youth to review the work. And I think there are a couple of things that I think are really important that they identified or highlighted for us in this work. First of all, they were astounded that there wasn't policy to support them. And they validated that it was really important that we needed it. They also really validated that it was important to be collaborative, restorative, and educational and youth friendly, that our policy has to be accessible to youth and developed by youth. And they really had this perspective that if you make youth a part of it, or it's not going to be have the intended effect that it's going to need, and also make youth a part of writing it so that it can be accessible to youth, and they can be active in highlighting its importance and sharing it. They also really wanted to ensure that there was an approach that recognized the role of development, that they talked about how youth are developing and still figuring out what they want. So they wanted to be an educative and supportive policy. It was interesting, when we talked about at the tertiary level about this idea of protection orders, they were not sure about that and wanted to know more information about what that would look like for youth, especially given confidentiality and privacy. But they wanted to sort of have more information and do more research on it. And then the last thing is that they were really concerned about policy for BIPOC and LGBTQ and trans youth, because they really thought that they needed to be included so that they would be able to their concern for those individuals was, how would you manage the process of relationship violence, or how would you ensure that the reduction of harm for these youth? Like I mentioned earlier, you didn't want to out them, or the concern about stereotypes and from that perspective that we're talking about, that broader socio-ecological perspectives about biases and discrimination and access to resources. So they really wanted people to think about it. So what is my take homes from the policy section? Is we don't have provincial and territorial children's service, education, or domestic acts specifically naming dating violence. We need to look towards the bullying literature and education, because those acts may apply, or they also may provide a basis for us to understand about how we can implement it. Because 20 years ago, we did not have provincial and territorial acts that addressed bullying victimizations. There are some domestic violence acts that may apply to youth and may provide remedies such as orders of protection, but not many and not clear. So it's really clear that we need to address teen dating violence. We need to name it in these acts, and we need to identify the remedies, but we need to do that with a youth perspective. And, we can catch up on this, and we can learn from the other countries that have been doing that work. Deinera, did you want to do the summary?
Sure. I'll actually just skip through it just for time. And I should say, we have till 12:15 on the books. I can stay a bit longer if folks have questions, but thank you, Wendy and Liz, for your great presentations as well. And maybe let's go to the next slide and take any questions that people have. Oh, sorry. And yes, I want to acknowledge it's a village. We just get to present. So a lot of our trainees have worked super hard on this, as well as gratitude for our funders, who, of course, we don't represent their viewpoints, but we're very grateful for the support they've provided for this body of work. All right, now you can go to questions.
And we're happy to take questions in the chat, or if people want to raise their hands.
I know Stacy mentioned one question on the HBSC was the comparator group all youth or youth who had dated? And yeah, that's very important. So the comparator group is youth who have dated in the past 12 months, but who did not experience violence. And we were pretty strict about that to make sure we were comparing to similar groups, at least in terms of them both having dated. And that is something you'll see in the literature. There's kind of a mix. Sometimes it's everyone, but most accurately, you want to compare to other youth who've dated but not experienced violence.
Well, maybe Liz, did you have any final comments, or Deinera, any final comments that you wanted to make?
I think just, the work you're all doing is so critical. And again, this is but one perspective on a really complex issue. And so we need work from, lots of different communities, ways of knowing, perspective. Centering of youth voice is so important and often gets overlooked by adults. I think about this a lot. I think we're still in very much of an awareness phase in terms of demonstrating this is an issue that needs to be taken seriously. If you look at the recent National Action Plan, there's lots of great stuff, but youth aren't in there. And so we have to keep as much, we want to center youth voice, but also use, our power as adults in this space to really keep advocating for youth being part of any work that we're doing on interpersonal violence. And then I think the policy stuff is really a huge area for work. We are continuing. So now, in addition to what Wendy presented, we're looking at every supplemental policy in every province and territory that could apply to youth. We have a law student who's going into case law to see if it has applied. So we're really trying to get a sense and then taking that to policymakers in each province and territory. And we will be looking probably for leaders in each province and territory to be our local champions on that, to really push for dating violence being centered in policy about violence and education policy. So for me personally, that's probably the area that most excites me. I think there's so much we can do to make changes to ensure that policy recognizes what a big issue this is for youth. So. And yes, the article was referencing is open access. So Liz, I think if you send a link to our website, they should all be up there. If they are not, let us know. We will send it. Yes, and if you want some of those stats for your curriculum, Liz will, I think, just put our website in the chat. Everything is up there. And so you can look at the open access articles. We also have research summaries for articles. So if you don't want to, read the whole thing, and if you have any questions at all or can't access something, please just, send Liz, myself, or Wendy an email. And thank you all also for coming. I know, busy week getting back to work. So.
Okay, and thank you, Liz and Deinera, for sharing your knowledge, your expertise, your experience, your research. It's always greatly appreciated and powerful when you speak, and having walked the journey with you, I always learn when I hear you speak. So thank you both.